Okay, everybody. We're gonna have Neil from Sentry up for a couple minutes here. I've actually seen his demo. It's really good. If I can find him. There we go. So we're just slightly behind schedule, but that's all right. We knew that was gonna happen. It's gonna be okay. Make it up in the breaks. Okay. There's Neil. How are you, Neil?
Hey, Ian, how you doing?
Good. All right, I'm gonna let you take it away.
All right, sounds good. I'm gonna go ahead and get right into it. I'm gonna share my screen.
Yep, looks good.
I believe, awesome, great. All right, so as developers, we write code, we commit code, it gets deployed, and sometimes we have bugs. We don't admit it, but yes, sometimes we have issues, and frequently we find ourselves not knowing about them. That's problem number one. Number two, once you know about it, you don't have the relevant context and find yourself digging through logs, digging through other systems, might take hours, might take days, and then we have to reproduce it and then investigate. Sentry aims to solve this for all different platforms. Since we're here and in front of the Laravel community, I'm going to concentrate on Laravel with my front end being in JavaScript. And the point being here is that what I'm about to show, the workflow and the features and functionalities will apply to any of these platforms and languages. I'm also going to be alerted in Slack today. I'm going to show you my favorite feature. I'm going to steal my own thunder here, but we will even show you the commit that caused the error. And we also integrate with Jira and any other of these systems. So issue tracking, alerting, source control management, as well as data forwarding. With that being said, let's get right into it. So like I said, I have a JavaScript React application and a Laravel. So let's just go ahead to our docs. I'm going to first go through the JavaScript side. So here, bam, browser JavaScript, it'll be a CDN include or an npm install, and then sentry.init. You'll get a key when you create a project with us. And then we want errors and transactions to be shipped up to sentry.io. On the Laravel side, it's exactly what you would expect. So composer package, set it up as a provider, an alias, and then in the error handler, we just want to handle it and then shoot it up to Sentry. So that being said, here's my application. I'm going to go ahead and try to buy some nails. And then when I click checkout, there is a request sent out to my Laravel side, and you can see there was an error and something got sent to Sentry as well. So in this case, if I wasn't using Sentry, I may or may not even know about this error. I would have to potentially debug with this browser log if I had it, which most of this is noise and irrelevant, and I don't have any sense of aggregated impact. And really, I'm trying to reverse engineer this and reproduce and go from there. But since I am using Sentry, what happened here is I got a Slack alert letting me know my application is broken and I should investigate. So from here, we can take some actions and click in and get right into our platform where we will tell you the who, what, when, where, and why. So this is on the front end side of things. So we can see a 500 error bubbled up. We have a bunch of events, so we aggregate all of these similar errors, and we can tell you the user impact as well. On the right-hand side, we're going to have aggregate data. So you can see this error has been flaring up over the last 24 hours. We can hook into any issue trackers as such, and then any heat maps introduced into our system will produce a heat map. Any tags introduced into our system will produce a heat map as such to help us understand what's going on. So you can see it's happening on all the various browsers, happening to my most important customers, in production on this release. And going back up to the top, we can iterate through all of these events or errors, see exactly what was going on. Most important to the developer, the stack trace, and we will deobfuscate the stack trace for you. So in JavaScript, this is referred to as minification and source mapping. And we even tell you what happened prior to hitting the error. So on the front end side, you can see a bunch of items were added to the cart. We click the checkout button. A request was sent out to the backend, which returned to 500 and then bubbled up to the global exception handler. And then any other information that the SDK deems relevant, as well as that you want to attach, can be done as well. And here what we see, and like I said, my favorite feature is that this commit caused this error. But looking at the stack trace, we can see that we didn't get a 200 from the backend, so an error was thrown. So let's go ahead and trace this to the backend. I'm going to click this transaction ID and widen my search here. And now what I see is that this front end error that we were debugging is a result of this backend error. So now I'm going to go ahead, jump into the Laravel side of things, and I can see that this is the commit that caused it. Here is the stack trace. So I'm in routes.web.php. And you can see even the variable values at that point in time for each frame. So you have all the information that you will want and need. So you can fix it right then and there. Make a decision to roll forward, roll back. Here's the payload, the headers, as well as any other additional information the SDK surfaces or you want to attach. And you can see here, we have the heat maps and tags and such. And like I said, here, Neil Manvar wrote this code, which introduced this. So therefore should be assigned this issue because he can fix this and is the best one equipped to fight this fire rather than someone else debugging my code, reproducing and starting from scratch, because we want to get back to stable as soon as possible. So to summarize here, Sentry tells you that your application is broken. Additionally, we're coming out with new performance features soon to hit Laravel as well, letting you know your application is slow and it might be a result of errors as well. But Sentry lets you know your application is broken, gives you all the details around it, front end, back end, mobile, any of the stacks, integrations, whether you want to be emailed, alerted on Slack or PagerDuty, we hook into Jira, etc. And at the core of it, we just want to let developers know that their app is broken, give them all the details so that they can fix and go back to developing or fixing more bugs, etc. Thank you, everyone. That's about it. If you want to go and get started, just go to sentry.io/welcome. We have a free trial, free to get started. We also are a open source platform, so you can also spin it up open source and use it yourself. So happy development, and hope you all use Sentry to know about your errors and fix them. Thank you, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Neil. Tying it in with GitHub and who to blame, that is, people here like that at Userscape World Headquarters anyway. That's going to be a popular one. All right, thanks a lot. Okay. All right, we're going. We have, see, you waited and we're slightly behind, but it's all going to pay off right now. We have the man, the myth, the legend, making his triumphant return to the world stage.
There we are.
There he is.
Hey, everybody.
Good to have you back.
Good, yeah. I had 2 kids over the last few years, so I took some time off.
Totally understand that. All right, man. Well, I'm going to let you take it away.
All right, let's do it. Give me just a moment. Let's go ahead and tweet that out. Okay, I think we are ready to get started. Yeah. So let me know if you can't hear my computer audio.
Audio's
so hopefully good. We're good to go there. My name is Jeffrey Way. You may know me as the creator of Laracast.com. We provide web development education for developers of all skill levels. And because I have you locked to your chairs, let me advertise to you. Give me 30 seconds and we'll get going.
Oh, Jeffrey, we can't see your screen.
No. Okay, 1 second. You can't hear me?
I can hear you, but I don't hear the, I know you had a thing that played that we're not hearing that or seeing that screen.
Yeah, let me see how I do this. Share computer audio.
There we go. Right. Now we see it.
Let me know if it works this time.
Yep, good.
Okay, sorry about that, everyone. The commercial begins again. Here we go. Come on, it's so cool. I can't even take credit. So I'm happy to compliment it because I didn't work on it. Our head of UI, Adrian, worked on that about a month ago. I love it. It came out great. So that's going to be what we use to advertise Laracast in the future. Thank you for coming along. So I recently worked on a new feature for Laracast that allows folks to purchase and redeem gift certificates. So I'll give you a quick Little example, it's basically what you'd expect. So you choose the plan you want, you fill out the details. I've already done this here. You choose when we're going to deliver it, you provide your Stripe information, you review everything, and you pay and send. So that will charge your card, it'll generate the gift certificate, it'll send you a receipt, and it'll fire off the gift certificate to the recipient. Anyways, as I was working on this, it occurred to me how the code I was writing today is very foreign to the way I might have written it 10 years ago, maybe back in 2005. And in fact, in some cases, I think my former self would be ashamed of the code I was writing today, which is kind of a funny thing. I'll show you a couple of examples. In the Laravel community, this is fairly common at this point, but we forget not even 5 years ago, this sort of CSS where we define the presentation directly in the markup was very much shunned. There was a smattering of people who did it, but by and large, this was not considered a good practice at all. So if I showed that to my 2005 self, I would have had some choice words, or my old self would have had some choice words about that practice. And to be fair, to this day, the HTML5 spec would have agreed with me. Here's what they say. Authors are encouraged to use class names that describe the nature of the content rather than the class names that describe the desired presentation of the content. So the HTML5 spec very much goes against this, and yet here we are. So when I think about that, it's hard to beat my former self up too much because at the end of the day, we're all just looking for the right way to do things. We may not admit it, but we're all looking somewhere to show us what is the proper way to do this, because I have a million different options. Just tell me what I'm supposed to do and I'll go down that path. So if the HTML5 spec says it, then of course that's what we would all do until you realize, give it a shot with utility CSS and you might change your mind after you maintain a project for a long time. Let's do another one. Inline JavaScript. I don't know about you, not very long ago, even today by some standards, this would be considered horrid. So what we have here, we have a little Flash component that uses Alpine behind the scenes. So you can see Xdata declares it as an Alpine component. Our source of truth sets the show property to false, and then we listen for a Flash event on the window. When that comes through, we show the Flash message in the bottom right-hand portion of the screen. I kind of like this, to be honest, but by 2005 standards, and many of you would agree in 2020 standards, this is not good code. It violates so much of what we've learned in the past about separation of concerns. And yet, I kind of like it. Excuse me. So yet again, 2005 me would have had some choice words for my decisions in 2020. And much of the community, even today, would agree with it. But especially rewind the clock about a decade, everyone would have called both of those practices idiotic. So with all that in mind, for this talk, I wanted to show you a variety of practices and approaches that I'm happy to use today that I might have criticized a decade ago. And for each section, we'll use real examples, and often those examples will come straight from that gift certificates feature I showed you so that it's as real world as possible. So I'm going to show you a little bit about Blade components, Alpine, Tailwind, Cypress for end-to-end testing, and then communication and patterns at the very end. Okay, so let's get started with the combination of Blade, Alpine, and Tailwind. I think as you're going to see here, Blade components are great, but I think the secret sauce is when you combine them with utility CSS and some kind of Tailwind-like JavaScript framework like Alpine. Okay, so we're going to start with the basics just to make sure we're all on the same page. So quick little recap. Let's say you want to make a Laravel Blade component. Okay, you create a file. You're going to call it heading.blade.php. You have a header, you have an H1 where you spit out the title. In real life, maybe a little more complex. You'll have some CSS there. I'm just keeping it super simple. Fine. Now, in the Laravel 6 and below days, if you wanted to call that component, so to speak, you would use the component directive. You provide the path to the view file, and then in the second argument, you can provide any data that component requires. But now sometimes that data is like HTML, and you can't easily pass it as an array key or value. So instead, you can use the slot directive. Yeah, and that's how you did it in the Laravel 6 days. And it's useful, but verbose enough to the point that I think it just didn't get much traction, included from yours truly. So in Laravel 7, we instead take a BladeX approach. So we're going to call the name of the component, which is heading, and then we precede it with x dash. So this makes it crystal clear. We're not dealing with an HTML tag. We're not dealing with the view component. We're dealing with a blade component. And then we pass any data it needs as attributes, as you see here. But once again, if you do need to provide HTML for a particular variable or something like that, you can use the X slot directive. So I don't know what it is, but this fits my brain a little better than the old ways, the old way with the component directive. All right, so let's start with something basic but practical, and I think this is really important. Don't get it in your head that a blade component has to be something fancy with a lot of behavior, a lot of functionality. It can be as simple as a wrapper around an anchor tag. That's entirely fine. So if we were to use a blade component for layout, have a look here. So we have our doc type, a title, and then a slot. Not with the old way, but if you were using sections and extends, the traditional way for layout files, that slot section would be where you yield the content. Okay, and this is it for our layout file. And actually, fun little fact, this is all you need. So notice I've omitted the head tag, the body tag, some meta stuff. That's fine if you want to include it, but fun little fact, the Google style guide recommends this because the browsers will add it for you automatically. So nonetheless, whatever you think about that, it's great for slides. Okay, so we have that component. If we want to reference it, we can just call it X layout, and then you add your slot there. And it's great. And I really like this. You can still use both. The old form is not deprecated. It's not wrong. It's just a different way to do things. And I find when we take this approach, notice how we start from the top down. So we start with the layout and work our way down. Whereas with sections and the extends directive, you're sort of starting from the bottom up. So decide for yourself if you like that, but I think it's cool. Okay, let's keep going with simple examples. A section component. So imagine any home page that's trying to sell you something. Every piece of that home page is divided into a section, right? It may look something like this. Maybe every section has some padding. You'll have an inner div there for a container. Maybe that sets the maximum width. It sets the margins to auto. You've done this a million times. All right, let's throw that in a component so we don't have to repeat it over and over. Now, we can call it as X section. And actually, real quick, if you're ever confused what file we are currently in for a slide, just look down there at the bottom where you see the file path, and that'll get you up to speed. Okay, let's keep going. Quick little example. How many times have you done something like this? So ignore the props directive, but somewhere in a form, you check, well, if we have a validation error for the title or the body, then echo it out within a paragraph, make it small text, make the text red, you get the idea. All right, let's just throw it into a component. So now we're adding a props directive that allows us to declare, well, what things do we expect? In this case, I need to know the name of the validation error that I'm checking for. Great. So now we would call it like so, and that might go beneath your input if you want. Now, here's the cool thing. Don't forget, all of these components can be cascaded, as you see here. They can be combined. So at the top, we have a layout component, and then we have a section within it. Maybe that section is your sign-up area. Then you have a form, and then you have your validation error component. And if you want to take it even further, the combination of that label, the input, and the validation error could be its own blade component. It could be form field, and then you pass through all of the props it needs, which would be like the ID, the name, the text, or anything like that. You can take this as far as you want. It's very cool. And we'd get something like that. Okay, so one last quick example, and then I think you have the idea. So if you visit the laracast.home page and you scroll to the bottom, you'll see the employee, the staff cards at the bottom. There's 3 of them. Here's what one looks like for Andre. Now, if you were to take a look at the markup for something like this, it's ugly, especially with the utility classes. I have to use the TW prefix just so I don't have any collisions, the SVG stuff. If you're not moving that to a blade partial, it's ugly. But here's the point. you only have to do it once, and I don't want to see this again. So we're going to throw it into a Blade component called staff card. Now, in order for this to work and be dynamic, I just need to know, what is the name of the person who works at Laracon? What is the title? What is their avatar? What is a link to their Twitter profile? So now on the home page, this is exactly what we have there. We call it staff card. And I think it ends up being a lot cleaner. And notice, traditionally, you might do something like a view component for this, which is totally fine. I really love view. But this is an option as well. And it comes with the benefit of it's clean. There's 0 build step. It's really nice. I like it. Okay, so now let's go back to that gift certificates feature. Everything's going to lean back in that direction just to make sure it's very practical. So notice the card you see there. So who should we send this to? That white background with the shadow. That is, you think about it, that's like every step of the form, sort of like a form wizard. Here is more or less the exact code we have here. So we have a step component that gets thrown in the components directory. And the only prop I have is the show prop. And we need to know, well, should I show this step of that checkout process? Now, within it, we have a card, we have a button behind the scenes that uses Livewire, which is cool. We're not going to talk about it in this presentation, but that's kind of cool. It'll submit an AJAX request. We will increment the current step of the process that will return HTML that gets swapped into the DOM. It's really cool. But anyways, you get the basic idea. This is a card, and it'll generate something like that. So now for every step of that checkout form, it looks something like this. Step 1, and then we let it know whether or not that step should be displayed. And in this case, I have the current step variable. Now, a little note here. When I was first building this, I thought, well, this is a traditional form wizard, so I probably need a wizard component. But as I was working on it, it occurred to me, I just about never create form wizards. This is probably a one and done thing. So I just decided, let's keep it simple. Just throw it all in there and then use the current step to toggle the display. And it works great. I'll be able to understand that 6 months from now, no problem. Okay, so now that we understand the essentials of Blade components, that might be a recap for some of you, or it might be brand new for others. Let's add another layer. So we're going to pull in Tailwind a little bit. Okay, so have a look here, a simple label that uses a input date Blade component. Okay, so if I could go back in time again and show my former self this piece of code, I think, again, I would have some choice words for this. I think I would have said 2 things. I would have said, all right, input date, that is not a thing. So get that out of here because you don't know HTML. Get that out of here. And then I would have looked at all of those utility classes and I would have said something similar. I would have referenced best practices. I would have talked about how it violates the cascading nature of CSS and why that is the best part of CSS. I don't think that now, but I did think that then. I would have mocked the disaster of having to repeat that CSS over and over and over for every single label on the page. I would have felt like this. And that's fine. You may feel that way too, by the way, and more power to you. We're still figuring this stuff out. I'm just showing you where I currently line up on these issues. But yeah, more power to you if you disagree. But anyways, instead, like a good boy, I think I would have recommended something like this. I would have started with that class, and I would have said, all that presentational CSS is horrible. Get it out of there and replace it with what it is. So in this case, form label, and you can store that in some extracted CSS file, whose position in your code base you will forget 6 months from now, and you'll have no idea where it's declared. And then I would have said, what you really want is the input type of date. I don't know what you had before, but this is what you actually want. And that would have been my improvement, quote unquote. Okay, but here's the thing. If a utility CSS framework takes a little bit of time, if your first reaction to it is a negative one, so was mine, and so was just about everyone's, it takes a little bit of time. You got to give it 5 minutes. That is a phrase I very much like. Before you advertise your opinion, give it 5 minutes. So if we think about it, and if you toy around with it, and it can be Tailwind because it's the most popular by far, but anything, that approach gives you flexibility. It gives you more configuration. It allows for rapid prototyping. It allows for ease of use with the I'll give you one caveat. If you know CSS, it offers ease of use. If it's not your strong point, you might want to use something like Bulma or Bootstrap. I think that's entirely fair. A prerequisite is a basic understanding of CSS. But it also ships with no build step. And as someone who works on the Laravel mix and deals with Webpack all the time, that is a win. I promise you. And then, of course, less naming things. We've talked about this many times. The act of figuring out a name for some of these CSS level components, it can waste so much of your day. It's very, very difficult. And it removes that obstacle entirely. Okay, so let's bring back that exact label. I'm specifically using something basic and common. Let's have a look. I'm now going to throw that label into a component, a simple label in a component. Now, if we think about it, what is the benefit to this approach? Well, we've now solved the issue of that repeated CSS. And that was one of my former self's criticisms, right? You're going to repeat that CSS for every single label. But if we throw it into a component, in this case, it's a blade component. It could be a view component. It doesn't matter. The whole idea is we are tucking it somewhere where we only have to call it one time, and we're not repeating that CSS anymore. And then notice that attributes variable. If you're not familiar with that, that's going to spit out any additional attributes that you pass to the component, like the class or the name or the for attribute, things like that. So now when we call it, it just turns into X label. So notice we've isolated that repeated CSS and we've solved the problem. So the ugly HTML problem solved. The repeated CSS classes problem solved through a blade component in this case. Okay, let's review an example from the gift certificates feature. A progress bar, you've seen this many times. So you're going to work your way through the checkout process, and that bar will animate depending upon which step you're currently on. Okay, here's what the static HTML for something like that might look like. So we have a wrapper div, that's the gray background, and then you have a child div, and that would be the blue bar that takes up however much space is required, depending upon the step the user is currently on, right? Very, very simple. Here I'm using a linear gradient because Adam just introduced utility support for gradients, but I didn't update it. But you would do that in that case, which is cool. I like that. Okay, so now let's make that a blade component. Progress bar sounds good to me. We would need to know, if we want to make this flexible, we would need to know, well, how many steps are there and what is the current step the user is on? And that's it. All right, we're going to throw that into a progress bar component. So notice in this case, it's the same HTML as before, but now in that little PHP block there, we are dynamically figuring out what the width of that blue portion of the progress bar is. Now for the props, again, we need to know the step and the current. So we're declaring that at the top. So notice in almost all of these examples, this is what you would call an anonymous blade component. You can have traditional ones that have a PHP class that backs it, but I so often just stick with anonymous components. That's where I find the most utility. And it works. So now I can use that anywhere. And we do on the site. All right, so now you've learned a little bit about blade components. We've learned how when we pull in Tailwind or any utility framework, we're able to solve some CSS problems there. Now let's add a third layer, which would be Alpine or something similar. Quick little basics for those of you who are not familiar with Alpine. I have no doubt Caleb's going to talk about this more, so we're going to go pretty quickly. Let's say you have a layout file. This would be your welcome.blade.php file. So I'm going to pull in Alpine through a CDN. Next, we're going to add an XData attribute to any element that we want treated as an Alpine component. And that's it. This is one of my favorite things about Alpine, by the way. If you've ever been in that situation with Vue where you're creating a file just so it could be reactive and evaluated, I love that I can just add an attribute anywhere I want, even on a single level, like an input that I'll show you in a minute. Even that would work. So I think that's a killer feature. Next, of course, we can make XData equal to an object, and that would be your, as we would traditionally say, your single source of truth. So in this case, we're going to have a title, and we're going to set that to Laracon. And if I want to echo out that title, I use X text. And again, notice this is very similar to Vue, not by accident. So in Vue, you might use vtext or vhtml, those directives. Very, very similar. So with that in mind, if you want to pick up Alpine, I promise you, you can learn this in an hour, 2 hours. And maybe not as dramatic as that with the flames, but I don't know about you. Sometimes when I'm learning something new and you get excited, it feels a little bit that way. Not so dramatic though. Okay, here's another example. So what about sometimes you want to pass server-side code or variables or values to your JavaScript, and it's kind of a weird, like, how exactly do I do it? Should I do that? I feel like I'm doing it wrong all the time. Let me show you how easy this is. Let's say we have a title PHP variable. I'm going to put it directly in the view, but it could be from a controller, whatever you want. Now we're going to create a div, and we're going to set the title equal to whatever's echoed out from that variable. And of course, this is going to work because Alpine's not going to evaluate it until the page loads. And at the point the page loads, that title variable has been echoed out. So it's just Laracon. There's no difference there, which is kind of cool. So now that solves that problem. If you've ever been in that boat of how do I have this PHP and I just want to pass it to my JavaScript. How do I do that? This solves that problem very easily. And as you'll find, there's some other ways to do it too. And once again, minus the flames, that's what you get. Okay, a couple other things. Sometimes you declare a component and you want to do something when it's initialized. So sort of like the mounted method for a view component. All right, just do X init and you're ready to go. In this case, when the component initializes, alert yo, yo, yo. Just a couple more quick basics and we'll get going. Maybe you want to register an event listener. We can use the @click, just like view. In this case, when you click on that button, we will show an alert and you'll see something like that. Really easy. Okay, so now the most basic thing we all do that I don't think has ever been used in an application ever, and yet we all find ourselves creating this stupid counter at one point or another. All right, have a look. This is what you would do, right? You would have a div, you declare it as an Alpine component. You would set the initial count to 0. You would echo out the current count using X text, and then you would just register an event listener. When I click on this button, increment the count. You know, it's such a dumb example, but I get it. These are nice ways to learn new tools or libraries or frameworks. I find sometimes people use very complex examples where you have to understand the domain, and it's too much. That's why we often reach for counters and to-do lists, because it's something you immediately understand, and that's why it's great for simple, basic education. Okay, so now here's where it gets cool, though, even for a dumb counter. Let's take that code back, and we're going to throw it into the components directory. So now this div with this Alpine logic is within is within a Blade component. So now I can, quote unquote, call the counter component like so, but now we have Alpine interactivity. We have some behavior. In real life, there'd probably be some Tailwind classes on there, and it's all wrapped up with an X counter. It's almost like Shadow Down type stuff. It's really cool. So if we were to create that, oh, I'm sorry, we already had that, but if you wanted to then pass a PHP value to it, you could do something like this. Exact same example, but now the user is specifying in their PHP what the initial count should be. I think this is cool, honestly. Now, X counter, the initial count is 10. That gets passed, that gets evaluated by Alpine, and it just works. There's no build step. You're not dealing with much JavaScript here. It just works. And of course, you can have as many of these as you want, right? The main point being each one of those is its own instance, which is the entire point of creating the component. Okay, so now you'll remember earlier, my former self was mocking that input date component, but let's defend it. So input type of date is really cool. It gives you a calendar in Chrome and Firefox. In the past, we were pulling in jQuery UI and these like weighty things just because you wanted a simple calendar. The problem is in Firefox, works great. In Chrome, it works great. In Safari, nothing is ever easy. So what do? I don't want to pull in jQuery UI. I don't want to research what calendar to use. So instead, why don't we just make it work for Firefox and Chrome like it already does? And then in Safari, I'm going to pull in the Cleave library. Now, if you're not familiar with Cleave, Cleave is like a input formatting library. It allows you to say, okay, well, I expect a date here, and it should have this delimiter, and it should match this pattern. And if the user tries to type anything that doesn't conform to that pattern, we're not going to let them. That's sort of what it does. So if I throw this in its own component, I kind of solve the problem. I'm not that upset if Safari users just see a placeholder. They can figure it out. And this solves the problem. It's very quick. Now, an interesting note here. Notice how I have X data on the input. And this is an important thing. You can declare a small, it doesn't have to be like a big div wrapper. It could be an input. It could be a text area. Anything can be treated as an Alpine component. So in this case, we do that in order to bind that cleave instance to the input. And traditionally, if you didn't do this, you might, in a main.js file somewhere, you do like a traditional jQuery selector to track it down, and then you bind cleave to it. I don't know about you. I kind of like this. I think I would prefer this when I come back to the code. Ooh, got to speed up a little bit. Anyways, xstate is what you would end up with. Okay, so now dropdowns. So here's another thing we use on that gift certificates feature. Traditional dropdowns. I'm sure you've implemented this many times on your own. If we were to do this as a blade component, not a view component, but a blade component that uses Tailwind, that uses Alpine, it might look something like this. Dropdown, we're going to have some dropdown links. And then we need a slot to declare what is the thing that will toggle the display of the dropdown. In this case, how about a button with 3 little dots, something like that. Okay, so this is almost like the TDD version of making a blade component. This is what I want. So how would I make it? Something like this. Don't worry about this code too much. Bunch of CSS utility classes. Who cares? Just makes it look pretty. Xdata, notice the only thing we're really tracking is whether or not the dropdown is open. That's it. So then that inner div you see there, the wrapper, it just toggles. So if open is true, then show the dropdown. If it's false, then don't show the dropdown. Now the only remaining step, of course, is we need the trigger itself. And that trigger is what will toggle the open status. And that's it. That's what gives us this. It's so easy. So then the only remaining step is each of those drop-down links would be an anchor tag, right? So I don't want to repeat that CSS. I don't think it's a big deal, honestly, if we did. But if you don't want to do that, throw that too into a blade component and you're good to go. And of course, you can even add transitions directly on that wrapper if you want. It's so easy. Okay, so I don't know about you, but I feel like the true power of blade components is when you pull in Tailwind and when you pull in Alpine. I think it takes it to the next level. It's pretty crazy. Okay, let's move on to something else. We only have a few minutes left. I'll try to go a little bit quicker. Use cases. This is something I've done for quite a while. I'm a big fan of use cases. 2005 me would not have been. I would have spoken at length about the single responsibility principle. I would have talked about how it violates it. And you may agree with me, and again, that's totally fine, or my former self. But if we were to give it 5 minutes, a use case is a written description of how users will perform tasks on your website. Fair enough. So my use cases are dead simple. First step, create a class where the name corresponds to the use case. And the use case is the thing the user can do with your application. So we make that match up. Next, add a handle method where you trigger the logic. That's it. It's kind of like a job. Hint, hint. So now if we were to think about it on a quick basic demo level, if you're purchasing a gift certificate, well, we have to charge your card, right? We have to generate a token that corresponds to the plan that the person purchased. We need to deliver the purchaser a receipt. And then if they designated to deliver the gift certificate today, we need to fire that off. Those are like the core steps that are required. All right, so here's the cool thing. We've written that out as comments. Let's just turn it into methods, all right? We'll give it 5 minutes. We're gonna turn it into methods. Charge the card, generate the certificate, deliver the receipt. And then we could even merge this if you wanted. But if the certificate is scheduled for delivery today, go ahead and fire it off. But yeah, you can merge that if you want into the deliver method. I'm just making it clear there. Okay, and that's it. Like, that's a use case. So think about all the things your application can do, the core things. Then when you're browsing, it can be in your use cases folder, wherever you want, you get an immediate impression of what the application can do. That's one of the core advantages of this approach. Now, of course, this goes without saying, and you're probably thinking this yourself, you don't want to go crazy with this. So by charging the user's card, If you're using Stripe or something, I'm not saying reference the Stripe class directly and everything that goes along with that. You're still going to delegate to lower level objects to perform the work. That goes without saying. But still, it's something to consider. Now, here's one of my favorite things. When it comes to writing tests for it, whether you do it before or after, think about it. Those comments that we had earlier that turned into methods are also the tests you need to write. Excuse me. For example, it charges the user's card. It generates the certificate. It delivers the receipt to the purchaser, and it delivers the certificate to the recipient if scheduled for today. Your tests are ready to go, so you don't even need to think about that. You already know what it should do. And again, I think that's one of the core benefits to this approach. Okay, so while we're on the subject of testing, I promise we only have about 2 minutes left. Let's talk about end-to-end tests. So yet again, this is something I might have shunned many years ago because we hear it nonstop. What do we hear about? And by the way, if we're not familiar with end-to-end tests, that is something that opens the browser, interacts with it. If it hits a third-party API or a billing API, it just does that. And that's why we say it's a true end-to-end test. It tests every piece of the puzzle. If I were to do an end-to-end test for a car, I would get in the car and I would start the engine, right? Have we not heard for so many years that they are horribly brittle? You should not write many of them, and the core of the tests you write should be unit level tests. Yes, and I'm not saying that's not true. Of course, there is value in unit tests and integration level tests, but there's also a lot of value for making sure the car starts when you turn it on, right? So I wish I would have written these more in the past, but I do now. So I prefer a tool called Cypress. There's also Laravel Desk if you prefer to stay in the PHP world. That works great as well. There's even extensions for it that simulate some of this that Marcel wrote. Okay, so if we were to very quickly think like, well, what should that gift certificate use case be responsible for? I need to make sure at the very least, there's no 500 error that keeps that page from loading. We have to make sure the happy path works. We have to make sure it redirects to a success page. We have to make sure if the charge is declined, we display an error message. So here's a quick video of the actual tests, kind of simplified, but notice how it's sort of like having your own personal robot that just makes sure everything works the way you expect. Because without this, you know that you're doing all of this by hand. Kind of cool. Okay, so if we were to just to quickly show you the basics of this, you might visit the page and assert that it contains some text. Or if you just want a 200 status, you could say cypress.request this endpoint and then assert that the yielded status is 200. Exact same thing. Another little example, like if no plan is selected, like let's say you visit that form, you try to click the next button, but you didn't choose an item from that first step. Let's make sure we see a validation error. These are the sorts of tests you might write. A happy path. This is kind of a demo version of it. We'll fill out the steps, click the buttons, type the text, and then ultimately when you submit the form, we should be redirected somewhere. Maybe we should see a certain bit of text. And when you run all of these, you have assurance that your code works. And that doesn't mean you aren't writing integration tests. It doesn't mean you're not writing unit tests, but it means you're positive that every piece of that puzzle, including the interaction with Stripe or Braintree, works. That's really useful. So now, last minute, sorry, Ian, if you need to set up the world. So this is one of the confusing things. You want a end-to-end test, but you still have to set up the world. Like assuming I have a user with this username, or assuming that I've refreshed my database, or assuming that I've run this command. Those sort of things you're kind of left on your own to figure out. So if you want to check it out, check out the Laracast/Cypress package, and this will give you a lot of familiar Laravel methods that you can invoke. Or you can even go there and just pluck what you want, because it's all set up so that you just grab the Cypress command that you need. Here's how you'd pull it in. And then you would have access to new methods like refresh the database, seed it. Cypress.create is the equivalent of a model factory. So all of this is available to you. Okay, I'm going high on time. Thank you so much. I hope you picked up a tip or two. Come by and say hi at laracast.com. And thank you.
Awesome.
Sorry,
Thank
Ian,
you so much.
went high.
No, it's great. And I just think it's great talk. Like, this is the version of web development that I enjoy. Like, what you're saying here is like I didn't, the old you, that wasn't my world. I didn't like that world. This world, it's great.
Sounds good.
Just great stuff, Jeff.
Thank
All right.
you.
Thanks a lot.
Appreciate it.